in 2011, when I finished graduate school, Julie and I went on this really long road trip, about 3 weeks. We drove from Denver up north and west to Squamish, British Columbia, down the west coast, stayed as close to the coast as we possibly could, all the way down to Tijuana, and then back up to Denver. So over 3 weeks, we were in 3 countries, like 6 national parks, drove a couple thousand miles, saw tons of friends and family. I had like 2 or 3 job interviews along the way. We were just really flexible. We had the opportunity. We had no kids. Julie had saved up time off. My job was non-existent, so it was really flexible. And I had the opportunity to go do this, so we went and did it. Now looking back on that, I'm like, I can't even believe, like I can't imagine anything like that until we're retired, right? Because there's just no way we could take that much time to go and do something like that. But we cherish it as one of our favorite memories. I mean, really a beautiful experience. But one of the most amazing things that happened on that trip happened in the first day. We left our house early one morning, and we started to drive north and on I-25, and then we eventually went west a little bit on I-80, and then north again, kind of along the Wyoming and Utah border. And at some point, if you've ever done this drive before, you get to northwestern Wyoming, and you can see for the first time the Tetons. And if some of you have like better Wyoming geography in your mind, you probably know exactly what point this is, but there's this point where you see it. And I had, when we saw it for the first time, an involuntary reaction to swerve our car to the side of the road. I put it in park. I got out of the car. None of this was voluntary. I didn't choose any of this. It just was happening to me. Got out of the car. I have a vague memory of like standing on the car or on the hood or something like that and like yelling something. I was so blown away by the Tetons. I don't know if you've ever had an experience by that, like pure amazement where you're not in control of yourself any longer. It was absolutely amazing. And it felt really good. Like I realized, and along that trip we had a couple other really amazing moments where we were just like kind of blown away by what we saw and what we experienced. But I realized in that time, and even increasingly more so since that time, that amazement is something that is far too rare in my life. Like as if I'm becoming desensitized by it because we spend so much time. I mean, our species is developing. We are developing things at such a breakneck speed. Like every industry is reinventing itself every single day. Do you realize we talk about self-driving cars like casually now? Have you ever noticed that? Like people will just like bring it up. Yeah, when we have self-driving cars, like, well, that won't be a. We just talk about that casually. Some of you in this room, you own a vacuum cleaner that you could control right now from your phone, okay? Like that's the world that we live in at the moment. And even if you don't have those things, you know about them, and they're kind of just normal things to talk about. We're really not that amazed anymore. In 1969, we put a man on the moon, and 500 million people tuned in to watch that. And I was thinking about that this week and thinking, well, we put other things on the moon, and we've done that quite a few times now, and frankly, it's kind of old news. Like if I told you that tomorrow night they're broadcasting somebody getting out of a machine and getting on, like stepping foot onto the moon, and it's broadcasted live, and you could watch it on your TV at home, would you rearrange your schedule to be there for that? Probably not, right? Like, nah. That is not amazing to us any longer. We're not amazed by these things. There's a lot of things that we experience that are kind of just old news, even if they're actually new news. Things would have been very different in the first century. You didn't know about things that weren't directly in front of you. Okay, so in the first century, let's say a little girl is watching the construction of the Colosseum, being totally in awe of the artifact itself. The architecture alone would have been amazing. What that building came to represent would have been absolutely incredible in both good and bad things to that girl. Meanwhile, she would have no knowledge whatsoever of the Himalaya Mountains, for instance. No knowledge. In her entire lifetime, she would never know anything about these majestic, incredible, mind-blowing, pull your car over to the side of the road and yell something mountains. She would have no idea. You were sort of faced with one thing that you were amazed with at a time. And so you can imagine when Jesus steps onto the scene, this onslaught of mind-blowing, amazing things for the people who were around him, like one thing after another. They were experiencing miracles that defied everything they knew about medicine or everything they knew about science or everything they knew about physics. He was teaching things that defied the law that had been around and in place for generations. He had a leadership strategy that seemed doomed to fail, and yet consistently brought bigger and bigger crowds and way outlasted his life. And then the coup d'etat, the resurrection. He dies. He's dead for 3 days. He doesn't stay dead. And then he doesn't leave. He sticks around to prove himself to people. He's with people. We know for probably around 50 days, he is with people in the physical artifact form of Jesus of Nazareth with them. Really amazing things. And I think one of the most amazing moments, it comes right before the ascension. Right before the ascension, we find it in the book of Matthew. And Jesus is with his disciples. He's with the 11 of them that are left, and he's in front of them, like the physical person of him. And we move right past the verses I'm going to read tonight to the Great Commission, this thing called the Great Commission at the end of Matthew 28, which is this thing that Jesus says at the very end, right before he sends, he says, hey, I want you to go and take everything that I've taught you, and I want you to go and make disciples, meaning I want you to go and help people understand this in such a way that they rearrange their lives around it. I want you to baptize them, which, although was probably referring to a sacrament of some kind, he was mostly referring to a recommissioning. He was saying, I'm commissioning you to go and commission. So it's this passing down of like, I'm telling you to go, and then you tell them to go, and then everybody's just going to go, okay? That's the Great Commission. But there are these two verses right before that have sort of haunted me throughout this Eastertide season. I've never really noticed them before. There's very little commentary or anything written about them, but I find them absolutely fascinating. It's Matthew 28, 16 and 17. It goes like this. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. I think some of you, maybe all of us at one point in time or another, have thought to ourselves, well, if Jesus stood right in front of me, then I would, of course, like it's a slam dunk. I would believe, I would understand, I would totally be okay with all the things that we say about Jesus. If he was right in front of me, it would be too hard to ignore. But here's the risen Jesus standing in front of his 11 friends who had known him, watched him probably go through suffering and death, seen him after the fact. This probably wasn't the first time they had seen him, and yet some doubted. It's a fascinating concept, and I think it's worthy of us unpacking just a little bit. It's interesting that the word doubt here is not the word that we think of when we think of doubt. It's actually this word distazo, which in my definition means hesitancy to believe, confusion due to lack of category or explanation of an event or fact. It's not outright doubt like atheism, for instance. It wouldn't be just saying like, well, I don't believe that Jesus is real. I don't believe that Jesus is God. Rather, it's a hesitancy. They kind of balk. They're sort of baffled. They're standing there in disbelief. They're just not so sure what to do with it all. The only other time this word appears is in Matthew chapter 14, also the same book, but different chapter. 14 chapters earlier, Peter is on this boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. There's this massive storm. He's afraid. Jesus shows up, not in a raft, not swimming, standing on the water, in the waves, and in the wind. And he says to Peter, walk out here to me. Peter, if we were to be nice, I guess we could say is spontaneous, right? And he hops over to the side of the boat, and he starts walking towards Jesus. An amazing act of faith. So not a doubter per se. And yet, at some point, he looks down, he sees the waves, he feels the wind, and he hears the storm around him, and becomes afraid, and he begins to sink. And Jesus asks him, why did you doubt? But the word that's used there is distazo. Why were you hesitant? Not why did you stop believing in me altogether? He had gotten out of the boat, mind you. He was not doubting the existence of Jesus, the power of Jesus, the ability of Jesus. He was just hesitant. He was like all of a sudden didn't have a category to fit this walking on water thing into. His imagination and mind was not able to stretch to include that. And that's the kind of word that is used here to mention or to describe these disciples. Some doubted, some experienced distazo, a hesitancy to believe. The other word that is used in the New Testament, the word that we're more familiar with in terms of doubt, is diakrino. And this word, diakrino, actually means to doubt outright, okay? To doubt the validity or truth or reality of an event or fact. If that was the word that was used, these would be people who were standing there saying, I'm not so sure that's even Jesus, or maybe this is a figment of my imagination. That is not what they are experiencing as they're looking at him. Not surprisingly, the Message, written by Eugene Peterson, unpacks this rather nicely. It goes like this. Meanwhile, the 11 disciples were on their way to Galilee, headed for the mountain Jesus had set for their reunion. The moment they saw him, they worshipped him, Some, though, held back, not sure about worship, about risking themselves totally. See, they weren't quite so sure how to step into this. They were like confused. They were mostly confused. Now, when I think about this word, I actually think about it in two ways, okay? So this word for doubt that we're talking about, this distazo, there's sort of two sides to this coin, okay? The first kind of doubt, or the first kind of disbelief that we see here is amazement, to be amazed, right? You can be in disbelief, you can stand baffled at something and be amazed by it. It's a positive connotation. Occasionally, we have moments where we are totally blown away. Occasionally, we have pull your car over to the side of the road and stand on top of it and yell something guttural and weird. Those sort of moments. Amazed, absolutely blown away. This past Sunday, we had our Eastertide happy hour after the service, like we'll do tonight. We do every week. And during that time, we have a time of sharing. We have some snacks, and we have a champagne toast at some point to celebrate the resurrection. But prior to that, we just let people share kind of casually. Like, here's what's happening in my life. Here's what God has done. Here's something to celebrate. And I expected it to take a little while for us to kind of get warmed up to it. But there was like no pause, no silence. People just had stuff to say. And they were, for me at least, like kind of earth-shattering things. Really amazing things. Carol Willis shared with us a verse from Joel about God restoring the years that the locust had eaten. And here she is, years after her husband's death, years after not knowing really where she would land, and owning a condo, owning property completely unexpected to her. A miracle, absolutely amazing that she owns property, totally unexpected to her. It's an amazing moment. Addie shared with us about her dad's choosing to be a part of a rehab program. Choosing that after years of dealing with a chemical dependency, stepping into that and choosing in humility to be part of something that could help him, that could reshape him, that could develop his relationship with his kids. Shelly and Dwayne shared with us about Shelly's sister. Shelly's sister had been hit by a car, and there was no telling if she was going to make it. And this month, instead of planning a funeral, they are celebrating a birthday with her. Amazing moments. Disbelief moments. Moments where we stand and we're like baffled that God could do something. Like provide a condo for Carol. Like provide rehab for Addie's dad. Like provide life for Shelly's sister. That's one side of the coin. There's this other side of the coin that I live with on a regular basis. The second kind of disbelief that we experience oftentimes is one of confusion. Sort of baffled, confused, not so sure what to do with what God is doing, or maybe not doing for that matter. We stand in disbelief. I ask questions about who God is all the time. And I don't know if that confession comes as an alarm to you in some way. I just so you know, I'm not like standing here having a crisis of faith on this rug in front of you. This is something my whole life I've just wondered. Is God as good as he says he is? Is he as present as he says he is? Is he as powerful as he says he is? Is he even around? Sometimes I just don't know. And I question those things. And I find myself confused. I find myself standing in disbelief. I find myself experiencing distazo. Not the amazed kind, but the confusion kind. Confusion is something that I wrestle with on a regular basis. It comes as a default to me, while amazement takes discipline. The other side of that coin, that other side of disazo, takes discipline. I have to choose it. I have to go to Eastertide happy hour and listen to what people have to say about what God is doing. I have to maintain a rhythm of gratitude and a rhythm of reminding myself of the things that God is doing. That takes discipline. Confusion is often my default, while amazement takes discipline for me. Tonight, I'd like to submit to you this, that the latter is a salve for the former. Amazement is a salve for confusion. It does not make it go away, but it soothes it. It does not make it disappear, but it makes it more manageable. When things happen in our life that cause us to feel disconcerted, to feel uncertain, doubt, confusion, stories like Carol's and Addie's and Shelley's, stories about the resurrected Christ, stories about amazing things that happen, these pull your car over to the side of the road and yell on top of it moments, those things soothe us and are a salve for the wound of the things that confuse us. It is not a naive or aloof. It is a courageous celebration in the face of pain, uncertainty and questions. This past week, there was a terrible event at a school not far from here. And when those things happen, when there's yet another school shooting, especially when it's in our backyard, I start to go down that road of confusion again. I stand in disbelief. I stand there doubting, and I wonder, God, are you there? What are you doing? Why didn't you stop that? How could that possibly happen on your watch? I start to wonder these things. And if it wasn't for moments where I can stop and I can remember Carol's story, and I can remember Addie's story, and I can remember Shelley's story, and I can remember Jesus' story, if I don't remember those moments of resurrection, I will be completely bogged down in those moments of confusion. If I can't maintain a discipline of standing amazed by what God has done, I will find myself bogged down in standing confused in what he did or didn't do. As I said before, amazement is a salve for confusion. And as we stand here on a Sunday where Maria Castillo, on the darkest of Mother's Days, experiences deep fear, confusion, pain. And yet, standing in stark contrast to that, Candace Brummie, on the first of Mother's Days, experiences hope and light and life in the birth of Salima. We live in this world where these two things stand back to back, two sides of the same coin, amazement and confusion. And we hold the responsibility as the church, as followers of Christ, to figure out a path through all of this, not to explain it away, not to pretend like it's not there, but to find a way through this with resurrection in mind. Walter Brueggemann writes this: the prophetic task of the church is to tell the truth in a society that lives in illusion, grieve in a society that practices denial, and express hope in a society that lives in despair. That is our task, church, to choose to be amazed even in the confusion, to choose to be blown away by the things that God has done and celebrate those things courageously, not in an aloof or a naive way, but in a real, honest way, despite some of the pain that we experience. We proclaim in Eastertide that Christ has risen. We proclaim that thing, and as weird and as wild as that may be, and although some of us stand at that and look at that in confusion and go, how can that be? How can that be possible? We must also stand in amazement, the other side of that coin, distazo. A hesitancy, believe, a confusion, sure, but choosing to be amazed by it. That is the path forward for us. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, thank you for an opportunity to gather. Thank you for an opportunity to hear from your word. We pray, God, that these short verses about your friends would give us peace and resolve to know that there are a lot of things in the world that don't line up, don't quite make sense, but in this season especially, but hopefully year-round, we can maintain a posture of being amazed. And we can thank you for the moments where you absolutely blow us away. May that be in front of our faces all week this week. And may praise be on our lips, even when doubt is creeping right behind it. Amen.